rumble in the foothills of Cameroon, Central, West Africa. Most of this storyline falls into the realm of fictional narrative to add brilliance and color to the story. Yet some names and places are correct and real. Now, this presentation is based upon slavery and the African slave trade, and what could have happened during those dark and ugly days during the slave trade rush in West and Central West Africa, when native Africans had to fight and organize among themselves to stay alive and free in their villages and country.
Tell us where you are watching from, like and share, smash the like button, squeeze the bell, and press the all button. We appreciate your indulgence. Watch until the end and give this story a thumbs up so that we can produce more stories like this one for you.
Let us continue our wild ride down through the corridors of time during the slave trade era. Indeed, when the thought dawned on me to do this presentation about the slave trade and slavery, there was a skeptical excitement in me. But my historical curiosity propels me forward, and I became conscious of the fact that some researches are best left undisturbed, but not this one, because there needs to be clarity, transparency, and understanding about the evils of slavery and its aftermath. And there were also conflicting reports of recorded history. And I also discovered that in this complex tapestry of historical investigation, most of the activities and wrongs done by the slavers were excluded from written public records, and we were fed the bare minimum to protect and place a full shield around the ring of the enslavers. Now, if the African slave trade intrigues you, and you need to learn more fundamental facts about the slavery system during the 15th to the 19th century, please press the subscribe button and tell us where you are watching from and share it with your friends. Part 1. This is the first part of the story about the ancient native Africans who were kidnapped from their villages, towns, and farms to be transported as prisoners across the great and wide Atlantic Ocean, to become slaves in America, in the Americas, and the Caribbean island of the sea. Therefore, for us to understand the pros and cons about slavery and the slave trade, we must go back to the slave trade era and start our investigative journey in Africa. And for now, we will keep our focus on West and Central West Africa. At the offset, the world watched without action, and with the knowledge that this sort of deliberate and deadly action was taking place. It is better to know the truth than to live in uncertainty. Uncertainty can eat you alive and can cause gray hair to start their protrusion. The fundamental code of conduct for the human smugglers during the slavery years in the slavery business seems to say to the ship's captains, travel from Europe to Africa and to America, and the Americas and to the Caribbean regions. Simply put, protect the ship and the crew, protect the manifest cargo for the exchange, procure and protect the human cargo, keep them looking healthy and clear for the sales block, get the best price, collect the money, buy more supplies for the bosses in Europe, and get ready to repeat the journey again. The logistics for the triangle route were complex but manageable. Those slave merchants understood the rudiments of human trafficking and developed their skills to achieve and maintained a wealthy lifestyle for themselves and for their shipping company bosses. Success in illegal human smuggling is never permanent, but rather temporary. The crusade to empty each and every African village of their able-bodied citizens was a travesty and a diabolical farce. We know wrong when we see it, and it is often clearly on public display. I would like to hazard a guess that the prisoners were now left with the dilemma of the shifting sands of time, because they will now have to adjust to their new environment and survive the rigors of slavery. Also embedded in the story, there are historical facts about the continent of Africa that is made up of about 54 countries, with many of them being landlocked, meaning they are sandwiched between other African countries with no access to ocean freedom or shipping accessibility. It is pointed out in many geographical articles that Cameroon is about the size of France, with about 200 ethnic groups. There are corn, millet, cotton, and other agricultural crops that are planted for survival by the natives. Presently, most Africans who live in the countryside always kept a fire lit on the outside in the yard to keep snakes and other insects and animals away from their dwelling. And the cotton harvest is always celebrated for its fruitfulness. whereby each laborer will have some money to buy food and pay for their child or children's schooling. And there lies the unfailing balance between being poor and being deprived of life's basic needs. Many countries in Africa are home to several tropical rainforests, mountain ranges, volcanoes, animals, birds, fish, and wildlife, which makes it one of the world's most ecologically diverse places in the world. So yes, indeed, life in Africa for the ancient Africans was a sweet and dandy place to live, breathe, and raise a family, even though technological advancement was lacking, just like other countries of the world at that time. There were gold, ivory, and other precious stone and minerals that were mined and removed by some European countries. But some secrets don't stay secret forever, and so the rush was on for more and more slaves. And then in walks other European countries, and the institution of slavery, initiated and started by the Portuguese or the nation of Portugal, was now splashing like sea waves upon the seashore. Often by force, Portugal conquered and colonized many areas in various countries, and at times, under the banner of Christian crusading missions, the Portuguese established settlements and trading posts, including, among others, in the countries they would later claim as colonies like Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, São Tomé and Príncipe, Mozambique, Goa, and Brazil in South America. On the European fronts, the primary slave trading countries in Europe were Portugal, Great Britain, France, and Spain, along with the Dutch, Danes, and Swedes. While Great Britain and France were the greatest owners of slaves in various countries of the world, so that when the scramble time came for the rush to share up the continent of Africa, those main countries were left with the greater slices of the pie from Africa, so that people in Africa now speak the language of the colonial masters of that time. Putting it another way, within those countries lies the corridors of power. Yet, they were on a collision course with destiny and the crucibles of competing ambitions and nations, because the slavery dynamics for each country saw the future operation to slice up the African continent into segments of their own, as the rush to own a part of the ever-present riches of an underdeveloped and dark continent, as it was referenced by the European countries, that was wide open for the taking, and the colonial occupation was in their peripheral vision. Instinctively, those slavers saw in their rearview mirror the possibility of owning a piece of the prime property of Africa, with its gold, iron, minerals, and ivory among other things. While on the other hand, the African natives only saw enemies with each shadow, visual or imaginary, from their own countrymen to the evil Europeans with their guns, dogs, and chains. The slavers' actions of forced imprisonment of black peoples from their homeland in Africa was tantamount to a gang day rape of a white girl in Europe, so that the start-up exercises by the Portuguese of prisoners from Africa was a crack in the slave labor wall, which became a hole. And with their success, it became a doorway for almost 400 years of the raping of a continent for slave labor in various countries of the world, where they could walk through that door to do vicious and ugly atrocities to other human beings. Talking about vicious, they also used viciously trained bloodhound dogs to capture the native Africans in their country, which was adding fuel to the fire, and was part and parcel of the enslavers' endgame to successfully reach more prisoners for their crimes against humanity and more bang for their slave auction block payment, which means more money in their pockets and a larger share in their company's portfolio. However, one's action has a way of rewriting history, but there was no new horizon of hope for the natives. However, I cannot forget the aquatic birds frolicking lazily in their mangrove swampland watery forest habitat, where the cry of the fish eagle is heard and is known as the voice of Africa. And toads and nocturnal animals and insects are giving their mating call or their domain signal call. The sandy roads are shared by the village farmers going to and from their fields, along with animals traveling to and from grazing pastures. Not forgetting that the yearly migrating animals have to cross several rivers, grasslands, forest and wetland fields, with danger on all sides, from crocodiles, lions, hyenas, and other ferocious and blood-sucking carnivores. There is no other country in the world like Africa with the greatest number of wild animals, where the drama of life and death are played out over and over again among the hunters, like the lions, leopards, and hyenas, and the hunted animals, like the gazelle, rabbit, and the buffalo, with life and death within their reach. Now, let's take a look further. And of course, let's not forget the quarrelsome and feathered scavengers birds like the white-backed vultures, the secretary birds, also known as the snake killer, which is a rare African and determined eagle-like vulture that will put up a good and long fight to achieve its evening meal. Whether it's a big mamba snake, a small animal, or a rabbit, watch out the success of this vulture. Also, the griffon vultures, the lappet-faced vultures, and the Eurasian griffon vultures and other meat-eating birds waiting in the winds to eat leftovers from killed animals after the big meat-eating animals were finished. Yet, instead of eating, many of these vultures want to mate or fight to show their dominance and display their skills. So yes, indeed, Africa's wildlife is an eternal arena of survival of the most ferocious and vicious animals, spinning in a relentless cycle of the hunter and the hunted. And the giraffe that stands tall and elegant in the open fields and forests, eating from high up in the acacia trees that has sharp prickles and dangerous disposition but are no problem for the giraffe's long mouth and hard tongue that can withstand the rudiments of pain from those prickles. And along with other impressive species of animals, they can all be found on the continent of Africa. Further, we definitely cannot overlook the enormous elephants and other large animals, like the African rhinos, that are endangered species in today's society, but are still hunted for their horns in the use of Chinese traditional medicine, to be used for the handles of utensils and carvings and for a show of wealth to others in those Asian countries. Actually, the natural rhythms of the regions in Africa are home to the so-called Big Five animals, namely the lion, the elephant, the rhinoceros, the buffalo, and the leopard, and can be seen in their natural environment or habitat in Africa. But let's not forget, as you travel further with me, down through the corridors of time, and take a panoramic view through your mind's eye, you will see zebras and antelopes feeding on the foothills of mountains, and then hustling to springs and rivers to cool their thirsty bodies. And where some animal population occupies savannas and are sometimes left alone by the usual enormous number of predators, who might be waiting in the bushes to snuff out their lives. But Africa is also known as the cradle of mankind. It is also mentally inspiring, watching the beauty of the yearly great migration of thousands of animals, including the wilder beasts and other migrating animals crossing the Great Divide at certain times of the year, on their mass migration to find different kinds of food with special nutrients along with water, and then traveling back again to their original domain. While the danger of crocodiles lurks in the shallow of deep rivers, lions on the plains, and other vicious carnivores are ready to rip them apart for their daily food. Most migrating animals will be lucky to cross the plains, forest, and rivers safely, but some will not be that lucky. What beauty and what grace to see the wonder of nature and understanding a little more about nature's God, in that He provides food for all His creatures in their season. There are also large trees in some areas that provide fruits/food, shade and water for the natives and animals. And these trees are called tree of life as well. Just like coconuts, trees that provide food and water in tropical Caribbean countries such as Jamaica in the West Indies. Meanwhile, at times during the hot season, the natives struggle with the hot air against the oppressive heat hovering heavily above the ground and causing dust storm for the natives. And sometimes in West Africa, with the relentless desert wind blowing with suffocating determination, the foot tracks become dusty paths, barely navigable and are virtually impassable, but they are used for moving cows, goats, and other farm animals during the rainy season when the rivers and plains are flooded. These beautiful landscapes of Africa, however, are breathtaking, thrilling, and stunning to see and ponder upon. At this point, I trust you will keep your reasoning and critical thinking cap on and walk further with me through this maze of hunting, catching, chaining, shipping, selling, and the plantation life of the prisoners turned slaves. But first, the ancient African males were strong, very strong, muscular, brave, hardworking, and daringly daring. The African females were fine, fair, and resilient, sexually productive, and were very supportive of their husbands and children. and together they were family-oriented, and the family structure was very tight-knitted. This is the Africa where the villagers were kidnapped, taken as prisoners to comprise the labor force in the plantation countries of the so-called New World. But there was always risk for both slave merchants with their guns, dogs, and chains, and the villagers with their bows and poison and non-poison arrows and other weapons of war. Further, geographical awareness tells us that Cameroon is not in West Africa, but rather in Central Africa close to West Africa. Cameroon's nearest region to West Africa is its western border, which directly borders Nigeria, making the western region of Cameroon the closest part of the country to the West African region. Actually, Cameroon is situated at the junction of Central and West Africa, with its western side bordering Nigeria, which is considered part of West Africa. And because of its close proximity to West Africa, it is often referred to as Central West Africa. Cameroon was one of those African countries where prisoners were captured during the slave trade and taken to various foreign countries as slaves, such as Jamaica, Brazil, and America. So yes, the Cameroon coast was a major hub for the slave trade. Now, the beauty of the past is not to look down so much upon the wrongs of society, but to learn social and moral lessons and how to avoid those mistakes again. In other words, historical data is gold in the hands of informed people, someone once said. To many minds, the origin of the international slave trade, the reason for its long existence, and the dark acceptance by the ruling masses are a source of great perplexity to many fair-minded, rational, and modern-day historical investigators. They see the work of evil, with its terrible results of the rape of a continent, the woe and desolation, and the physical and psychological evil distresses, and the exercise in the enterprise, and what those acts caused during and after the slave trade was over. And, as we further question, could it be that this evil can raise its ugly head again in this world? Now, according to historical history, over the period of the Atlantic slave trade, from approximately 1526 to 1867, some 12.5 million captured men, women, and children were put on ships in Africa, and 10.7 million arrived in the Americas and the Caribbean. During this historical investigation, we will take a hard look at the facts in its historical context, because the only thing we have to fear in the future about the wrongs of slavery and whether or not this evil will ever show its ugly head again is if we forget the past and allow it to happen again. The slave merchants acted with surgical precision, knowing the quality people they wanted, those that will get the highest price on the auction block and get the job done on the work site, on the plantation, farms, building, and canal building projects in the so-called New World for empire building. The slave merchants were not interested in any wishy-washy, weak and frail persons that could not bring a good price for their human merchandise. Males had to be strong, agile, muscular, and healthy. Females must, in most cases, be young and beautiful to be inducted into the slave production farm to produce more young slaves. The slave merchants really had a diversified portfolio all wrapped up and tangled up in the slavery enterprise, which was second to none. While most of the world stood looking at the atrocities meted out to the slaves with their eyes wide open, with no one strong and brave enough to speak up or to put a stop to the trade, at least not yet. The ancient farmers were suffering from sun heat, rain, and overwork from manual farming and stagnant productivity, with no help from the gold diggers, the rubber sap robbers in the Congo, the ivory robbers from Ghana and Mali, and the robbers of the other natural minerals from Africa, without the consideration of the Europeans giving a helping hand to the natives in social and agricultural advancement. And now they wanted the lifeblood of the natives through forced displacement, with an effort to tear each victim's family apart, with an attitude that defies conventional wisdom and human sanity during the slave trade era. I guess the slave merchants reasoned within themselves that the arms of Africa were open wide to those that were willing to enter and remove forcefully for themselves, those they needed for work on their plantations, farms, building projects, bridges, and tunnels. Because beautiful flowers bloom and blossom in a forest, even when there is no one there to admire its beauty. Abraham Lincoln once wrote, "Imagine with me this scenario that will help to broaden your horizons on this subject matter. as we look at the historical context of slavery. The cool breeze sexually lashed against the big ship, hugging against its exterior and visible interior, as it pleasantly kept humming with time and space in the normalcy of another good day on the ocean waves heading to Africa, to collect prisoners to become slaves in the colonies of America, the Caribbean, and the Americas. The strong waves were mercilessly lapping against the big ship's exterior. The 6 slave merchants and 3 slave doctors on board this large slave schooner leaned back in their seats on board ship with eyes wide open and flicking between their cigars. The ship and the shore and the dock ahead, and the excitement of the vast crowd of native slave catchers and slave sellers waving to the ship's captain and the crew. This goes to show how delighted those African slave sellers were to get money, or cowrie shells, textiles, metals, cotton, fabrics, iron bars and pots, brass pots, hats, raincoats, guns and gunpowder, rum, trinkets, food, and other precious needed commodities in this ancient neck of Central West African hood. This large slave ship that was coming in to dock at the slave dock was owned by the famous Brooks Shipping Company from Liverpool, England, and could easily hold 500 prisoners sailing from Africa. Liverpool was considered as the gateway to the British power in England, and Liverpool was fast becoming a famous port city. But actually, this Brooks ship was designed to carry around 454 slaves, but often it carried much more. While many laws limited the number of slaves a ship could carry, many times the captains often exceeded those limits and carried excess passengers for profit, which would go into the pockets of the captain and his crew to have more fun in the sun with women, food, and strong liquor drinks at their destinations. Meanwhile, on land, at the dock, male and female vendors were waiting and waving delightfully at one corner of the dock with their field products. There were several food and meat vendors there, ready to sell their field-grown yams, sweet potatoes, cassava, corn, peppers, and other food and vegetable products, along with animal bushmeats and other meats to be used for food on the second leg of its destination to the slave-buying countries of Americas, Brazil, and the West Indies. Indeed, the slave merchants really had a diversified portfolio, all wrapped up and tangled up in the slavery enterprise, which was second to none. It is important to remember that Europeans also used brutal dogs to track, intimidate, corner, and attack enslaved people. And this deadly system was weaponized by the European enslavers within the Atlantic slave trade system. Indeed, the European enslavers developed the practice of using specially trained, aggressive dogs to enforce the capture of prisoners in Africa. This practice was systematically expanded and used by the slave buyers in most of Africa, and the dogs were bred and trained to be very aggressive and deadly in their quest to control the narrative of ensuring that the enslavers get their desired amount of slaves. This network of breeding, training, and facilitating the use of those slave bloodhounds to corner and catch their victims, before chaining them for the journey to the slave-holding areas at the port slave castles and then to the slave ship. These bloodhound dogs look fierce and deadly like the Doberman dogs of today, in size, speed, strength, and aggressiveness to capture slaves in Africa. And so the dogs served as a vehicle of terror, enforcing the brutal system of catching the natives on a daily basis. And so yes, the slave practitioners were playing with the slave trade venture on the edge of a precipice, by plundering the villages to satisfy the financial greed of the noble class slave owners. But the sweetness of the game would one day lose its sweetness. They were exercising their catching, the imprisonment, and the selling of the innocent Africans natives with the ambition of a madman. And yes, the natives were now in the camp of many enemies, their neighbors, their village leaders, the village chieftains, the slave catchers, and the slave buyers. And so they had to act with smartness, courage, and determination. The attitudes and actions of the white man toward the blacks during the slave trade era was so dark and evil that many authorities refused to come to terms with the truth about the treatment toward the blacks, while some royals, historians, analysts, or politicians' personalities may personally express sorrow over slavery and the overall atrocities of those colonial-era days. Governments who were involved in the trade will not, or they refuse to touch the subject, will a long bamboo pole, because doing so would fuel the flame of fire for the demand for reparations. But if reparations were to be considered on a large and serious scale, there would be many aspects of slavery that would have to be considered. Like the African slave sellers and their countries, the African slave catchers, the European shipping companies, the European ship's captains, the plantation owners, and the countries who were the benefactors of benefits of the slave labor. And so, no country is willing to stir the dog fesses on the ground, knowing that the overall smell would be unbearable and painful for all those families of the enslavers who are still alive, which would amount to 0 people. Except for the countries that were involved in the trade. And of course, the countries involved are not willing to pay reparations to anyone, contrary to what many are hoping for among the black mouthpieces in the society.